comes first. You're watching WECT News.
The oyster population in North Carolina has decreased about 90% since the 1900s, according to the Coastal Federation. That's why that nonprofit organization and the State Division of Marine Fisheries are working to boost the numbers in our area waterways. WECT's Ariana Bertolotti got a closer look into the artificial reef being built near Carolina Beach State Park. It's designed to not only help grow the oyster numbers, but help the entire ecosystem too.
This is the barge that are taking rocks like these and dumping them into the Cape Fear River to create the artificial oyster reef. The reef is designated by these white posts in a project that initially started in 2017.
We are full.
The barge is now full of rocks that will help build the artificial oyster reef. With the worldwide population of oysters declining, the Division of Marine Fisheries, the North Carolina Coastal Federation, and the Carolina State Park are working together to give the local population a boost.
We've lost 90% of our oysters worldwide.
Cement rocks are taken from the Carolina Beach State Park and dumped onto the barge. And next, the rocks are transported to the artificial reef where they will be hosed down and dumped into the Cape Fear River. Oysters are not only an enjoyable appetizer, but they also play a significant role in the ecosystem by acting as engineers for water filtration and attracting other fish to the area.
Oysters will settle on the concrete that we're putting out. They'll begin to grow, and then all of the little nooks and crannies in between the oysters provide habitat for shrimp and for crabs and for small fish species that in turn bring in larger fish species that are there to eat those.
Restoring the oyster population throughout the state and creating fishing and diving opportunities is the main goal, with the reef being accessible by kayakers, small boats, and shore-based anglers. Construction at the reef is set to be complete within the next few weeks. Until then, visitors at the Carolina Beach State Park Marina are asked to exercise caution around the marina. On the Cape Fear River, Ariana Bertolotti, WECT News.